Now, transpersonally, our beliefs, our justifications, the stories that perpetuate all of our old behaviors, our old habits, and healthy forms of self-expression, those are the dross of our character. And those are the things that are going to be burnt away through working with fire. And primarily, we're going to work through incineration and calcination. So we perform incineration and calcination by applying the fire of our scrutinizing intellect or our scrutinizing attention, which is basically unrelentingly saying, why? Why? Just imagine that you're like the annoying child version of yourself, just constantly asking why to your parents, but you're doing it to yourself. You're going to get annoyed. It's going to make you angry. This is producing the element of fire, that friction inside of you, and it's unrelenting. And you're also the one, the recipient, and you're not going to allow yourself to lie to yourself in this case. We need to apply that honesty of the spiritual dimension, that archetype of fire, that high vibrational nature to ourselves in order to reverberate, which is to say to kind of roast the heat, to constantly take the vibrations and toss them back and forth without losing them. That's what a reverberating furnace kind of would do. We're going to reverberate our own justifications to a feces, which is to say we're going to drive them down to their essential ash. We take full accountability for every situation we put ourselves into. If you were a child and you're dealing with a early childhood developmental trauma, which I told you probably don't work with those types of things in this class this time, try and do something more manageable. But if you're doing that, you're going to have to change the perspective that you decided to be put in that situation, even if it was a parent or a guardian or whatever else that put you in there. So we have to take full accountability, like, I wouldn't have manifested that situation if it wasn't in my highest and best good. That's the way that we would take accountability for that. But you need to have perspective enough through this process to see how that could be true before you approach it on that level. Otherwise, it could seem like you're lying to yourself again. There's a fine line between that. But that's why I also said, with the caveat, don't bring your core childhood traumas to this particular class. What you learn here will be applicable there, but you need to learn to lift smaller weights before you put on the big yokes and try and walk across the gym. So when we encounter the stories, justifications, and or reasons for why we are the way that we are, we end up crushing it over and over and over. That is a big part of the process of calcination. After incineration, we're left with this ash. There maybe are still charcoal bits and black bits in there. We have to crush it and pulverize it to a very fine powder. And then what we can do is put that into a dish and then calcine it extremely well so that all of those toxins that are in there, all of those little black bits, are able to be completely burnt out of the material and turn into as fine white and ash as possible. When we're doing this in the laboratory, not everything actually turns white, at least not initially. It will definitely be like a pale gray, but it's as white or as light as we can get the work, because we're going from the alchemical term of is called the nigredo, the black phase of this charred material, to the white phase. That's our next step. And the white phase is going to be that pure whiteness eventually of our salts, our precious salts that are potassium carbonate, or at least they are through the way that I'm going to be showing you how to perform transpersonal alchemy. So with that being said, we have to crush these stories, these justifications, these reasons for why we are the way that we are, and then we hit it again with fire, again, that unrelenting why, and we just keep doing this. It's like, I don't buy into this story that I'm telling myself. And when I ask why, if that's not deep enough, I don't buy that story. I'm going to crush that up and I'm going to apply it to the fire and say, okay, well, maybe that was true, but why was that true? And then again, you just keep breaking apart these justifications, these reasons, so on and so forth, until we get to the essential heart of the matter. Now, the effects of this, which is important before I start giving you examples and opening up to questions, is that we end up becoming honest with ourselves, unadulteratedly honest. There's so many aspects of us that we at first don't really want to see, that we push them into the subconscious component of our psyche, into our sulfur, and we say, I don't really want to look at that. That's too painful. That's too hard. I don't want to notice how big of a pain in the ass I am, or what my dark spots are, like what is my shadow, so to speak. Fire brings those things into the light of the conscious mind by illuminating the circumstance. And it also burns the things that are at the core of those experiences and the reasons why you're justifying not wanting to pay attention to it. They break it down. And so it can help us to move past painful memories and traumatic instances by burning those away and getting rid of the justifications and the beliefs and the stories that lock us into being that particular way, being in those self-defeating phases or those unfavorable life circumstances, whatever you want to call it, unfavorable, unfulfilling. We, through working with fire, we can begin to acknowledge that if we want to transform into our highest version of ourselves, we have to isolate that aspect of ourselves that is actually pure enough to go through the fire and still remain without being destroyed. And that's this ash. Everything else gets burnt away. The sulfur and the mercury of the material is burnt away, and all we're left with is the salt in a really kind of dirty and impure form at that. But that still passed through the fire, and the purity of our salt actually exists within there. We just have to know how to access it, which I'll be able to walk you through. But that first step is getting to that pure ash so that we can even access that material. And that allows us to be brutally honest with ourselves and no longer buy into the stories that we tell ourselves. This is probably the most important thing. Like, I remember teasing with friends and, we do something and they're like, the first step is admitting you have a problem. That is true with this calcination process. You have to admit that you have a problem, and then you have to admit why you have that problem over and over and over and over and over again until you get to the rawest, most deep part of it, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. So we use the fire to get to the heart of why we are the way that we are. The process is meant to leave us feeling psychologically roasted, but lighter and honest and more pure. So that weight upon our shoulders, these aspects of us that we're trying to hide from the world that always are weighing on us, we can begin to operate without them after we go into the calcination process. In fact, we're as light as ash. And so if we're not careful, we could easily be blown away. And that's why it's important for us to only stay in this phase for a short period of time. Being in fire for too long is way too intense, and it can leave a person feeling really burnt out emotionally, physically, mentally, etc. So this is why we only last for about a week in this frame of calcination. And once you guys learn this process, you'll be able to do it probably faster and faster each time. Just like once you get familiarity in the lab with actual calcination, it becomes a little bit faster most of the time. Again, depending on the material that you're working with. Some materials are harder to calcine than others, and that's going to be true too. That same metaphor works perfectly with the individual themselves. Some of the things we want to work on will be a very easy calcination. Other things are going to require us to go really quite deep and to have continual series of asking and questions. So one final thing is that this process may actually, by going through calcination, you may get so raw and so honest with yourself that you immediately start to dissolve, which is to say to express this released emotion and begin this next process of the archetype of water. If that happens to you, that's absolutely fine. You're just leading naturally into that process. You're not having to be guided to it. That's fine. All I'm going to ask you to do is to journal about all of that. So